Behind a crumbling barn in rural Texas, authorities made a heartbreaking discovery. A young bobcat who had spent years trapped in a backyard poacher's cage. Paralyzed by fear, she huddled in the darkest corners and trembled at the faintest hint of a human presence. When rescuers finally arrived, she pressed herself into the corner, as if the battered walls were the only things keeping her from falling apart. When she was brought to a wildlife sanctuary, she was physically safe but psychologically shattered. For days she faced the wall, refusing food, refusing every overture. Her tiny body quaking with a terror so profound it seemed ready to extinguish her spirit entirely. The expert caretakers were at a loss. But then, an unexpected visitor arrives. The woman sees the broken creature huddled in the corner and decides to try something no one else has. Could that quiet act of kindness reach a wild animal lost in the depths of despair? Before we start, hit the like button and make sure to subscribe if you haven't, and hit that notification bell so that you won't miss any new stories. The August heat in West Texas was merciless, bearing down on the ramshackle property like a physical weight. Hidden behind a dilapidated barn, rows of makeshift cages held creatures that should have been roaming free. A coyote with a mangled paw, several desert tortoises stacked atop one another, and in the darkest corner, a young bobcat pressed so tightly against the cage wall that she seemed to be trying to disappear into the rusted metal itself. Serafina, though she wouldn't receive that name until much later, had known nothing but this cage for the past 2 years. The poacher who'd trapped her as a kitten had dreams of selling exotic pets to wealthy collectors. But those dreams had withered like everything else in this forgotten corner of Texas. What remained was neglect, fear, and a young bobcat who trembled at every footstep, every shadow, every sound that might herald another day of torment. When the anonymous tip came to the wildlife authorities, Officer Jake Martinez had seen plenty of illegal animal operations, but this one made his stomach turn. The animals were malnourished, dehydrated, and psychologically broken. The bobcat was the worst of all. She wouldn't even turn to look at them, just pressed her face into the corner, her entire body vibrating with terror. "Jesus," Martinez whispered to his partner. "How long do you think she's been like this?" They'd never know the full story, but the evidence painted a grim picture. Scars on her legs suggested failed escape attempts. Her fur was patchy and dull, signs of chronic stress. When they finally managed to transfer her to a transport crate, a process that required sedation because she fought with the desperate strength of pure panic, she immediately wedged herself into the corner again, as if the walls were the only things keeping her from dissolving entirely. The Second Chance Wildlife Rehabilitation Center sat on 50 acres of Texas hill country, far from the bobcat's desert origins, but infinitely better than where she'd been. Director Margaret Hollis had been rehabilitating wildlife for 30 years, but when she saw the bobcat arrive, even she was taken aback. "Put her in enclosure 7, she instructed the staff. "The quiet one, away from the other animals, and nobody goes near her unless absolutely necessary. This one's going to take time." For 3 days, Serafina, now officially named by the staff, didn't move from her corner. Food placed near the enclosure entrance went untouched. Water bowls remained full. She faced the wall as if it held all the answers to questions she couldn't voice, her spotted coat rising and falling with rapid, shallow breaths. "She's shutting down," veterinarian Dr. Robert Jim observed during a careful examination through the enclosure bars. "Classic trauma response. If we can't get her to eat soon, we'll have to intervene medically." That's when Emma Parker arrived. Emma wasn't supposed to be there that day. A wildlife photographer by trade, she'd come to document the center's successful release of rehabilitated hawks. But as she walked past the enclosures with her camera, she stopped short at enclosure 7. Through the chain link, she saw the bobcat, just a huddled form in the corner, so still she might have been mistaken for a pile of fur if not for the occasional shudder that ran through her body. "What's her story?" Emma asked Margaret, who'd been showing her around. Margaret sighed, explaining Serafina's background and current state. "We've tried everything. Different staff members, different approaches. She won't respond to anyone. It's been 5 days now since she arrived, and she's barely eaten anything." Emma set down her camera bag. "Can I try?" Margaret raised an eyebrow. "You're not trained in—" "I know," Emma interrupted gently, "but I've spent years photographing wild animals. I know how to be still, how to not be a threat. Maybe that's what she needs right now." After some consideration and a waiver signing, Margaret agreed to let Emma try, with strict supervision. Emma's approach was unlike anything the staff had attempted. She didn't try to coax or call to Serafina. She didn't rattle food bowls or make encouraging sounds. Instead, she simply sat down on the concrete floor outside the enclosure, about 6 feet from where Serafina huddled. She brought a book, an old paperback novel, and began to read silently. For 2 hours, she sat there. Serafina didn't move. Emma turned pages, shifted occasionally to ease her stiffening legs, but otherwise remained a quiet, non-threatening presence. When she left that first day, nothing had visibly changed. But Emma came back the next morning and did the same thing. On the 3rd day, something shifted. As Emma settled into her now familiar spot, she noticed Serafina's ear, just the tip of one tufted ear, swivel slightly in her direction. It was barely perceptible, but Emma's photographer's eye caught it. Progress. She began to speak then, very softly, not to Serafina, but simply allowing her voice to exist in the space. She read aloud from her book, her tone low and steady, like a river over stones. The summer had been long and golden, stretching endlessly across the prairie. Serafina's other ear moved. By the end of the first week, Serafina had shifted her position slightly. She still faced the wall, but her body had relaxed from its rigid curl. Emma celebrated this tiny victory privately, understanding that pushing too hard now could undo everything. Margaret watched from her office window, amazed. "I've never seen anything like it," she told Dr. Jim. "She's not doing anything special, just being there." "Sometimes that's what trauma needs," Jim replied. "A presence that demands nothing." On day 10, Emma tried something new. She brought a small piece of cooked chicken. Serafina hadn't been eating the raw meat they'd been leaving, and placed it halfway between the enclosure entrance and Serafina's corner. Then she retreated to her usual spot and resumed reading. For an hour, nothing happened. Then, so slowly it was almost imperceptible, Serafina began to uncurl. Her head lifted slightly from the corner, though she didn't turn around. Emma kept her eyes on her book, though every fiber of her being wanted to watch. A rustling sound. Emma glanced up to see Serafina had turned. Not fully, but enough to eye the chicken with one amber eye. The bobcat's face was beautiful despite her condition. Distinctive black markings framing alert, intelligent features. But it was the fear in that eye that struck Emma most forcefully. Raw, primal fear that spoke of betrayals too numerous to count. Emma looked back at her book. "You take your time," she murmured. "I'm not going anywhere." 20 minutes later, Serafina moved. It wasn't a walk so much as a liquid slide along the wall, keeping as far from Emma as possible. She snatched the chicken and retreated, but not all the way to her corner. She stopped midway, eyeing Emma while she ate. It was the first voluntary meal she'd taken since arriving. The next day, Emma placed the food a little closer to her sitting spot. Serafina took longer to approach, but eventually, hunger won. Day by day, inch by inch, the food moved closer, and Serafina followed. 2 weeks into their routine, Emma had her first real interaction with Serafina. The bobcat had just taken a piece of chicken from barely 2 feet away when Emma slowly extended her hand, not reaching for Serafina, just letting it rest on the ground between them, palm up. Serafina froze, the chicken still in her mouth. Her pupils dilated, and for a moment, Emma thought she would bolt. But curiosity, that feline trait that no amount of trauma could fully extinguish, won out. Serafina stretched her neck forward, whiskers twitching as she investigated this new element. Her nose touched Emma's fingertip for just an instant before she pulled back. But she didn't run. She finished her chicken while watching Emma's hand, as if puzzling out what it meant. "That's a good girl," Emma whispered. "See? Not all hands hurt." Margaret had given Emma a key to come and go as she pleased by this point, recognizing that whatever magic was happening shouldn't be disrupted. Emma began spending entire days at the center, always with Serafina, but also helping with other tasks, learning more about rehabilitation. 3 weeks in, Serafina did something that made Emma's heart skip. After taking her food, instead of retreating, she sat down. Not close, still a good 4 feet away, but she sat facing Emma for the first time. Emma got her first real look at Serafina in full. Despite her ordeal, she was stunning. Her coat, though dull from stress, showed the beautiful spotted pattern that helped bobcats blend into their environment. Her paws seemed too large for her body, suggesting she was still young, maybe 3 years old at most. But it was her eyes that held Emma. Amber gold with that distinctive wildcat intensity. But behind the wildness was something else. A question, maybe. Or a tentative hope. They sat like that for an hour, just existing in the same space. When Emma finally stood to leave, Serafina didn't retreat to her corner. She stayed where she was, watching. The breakthrough came on a rain-soaked morning in early September. Emma arrived to find Serafina not in her corner, but sitting by the enclosure entrance. When Emma approached, Serafina didn't move away. Emma sat in her usual spot, now protected from the rain by an overhang Margaret had installed specifically for these sessions. "Rough weather, huh?" Emma said conversationally. Serafina's ears swiveled at her voice, a response that had become common. Emma pulled out the day's offering. Chicken, as always, but also something new. A small ball with a bell inside, a toy designed for domestic cats but sized appropriately for a bobcat. She rolled it gently toward Serafina, who regarded it with deep suspicion. The bell tinkled softly as it came to rest near her paws. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, tentatively, Serafina reached out one paw and touched it. The bell rang again and she pulled back. But not in fear, in interest. Over the next few minutes, Serafina began to bat at the ball, her movements becoming more confident. It was the first time Emma had seen her act like what she was, a young cat, despite everything she'd endured. "There you are," Emma whispered. "There's still a bit of play in you." As if suddenly remembering herself, Serafina stopped and looked at Emma. Then she did something extraordinary. She picked up the ball in her mouth and took a step toward Emma. Just one step, but it was voluntary, purposeful. She dropped the ball and retreated, but the message was clear. She was choosing to engage. Emma rolled the ball back. This time, Serafina's response was quicker. Back and forth they went. A simple game that meant everything. When the chicken came out, Serafina took it from Emma's hand for the first time, her rough tongue briefly touching Emma's palm. The sensation sent shivers through Emma. Not fear, but awe. This was a wild animal choosing trust over instinct, hope over experience. As the weeks turned into a month, their relationship deepened. Serafina began to anticipate Emma's arrival, often waiting by the entrance. She became playful, batting at sticks Emma brought, even attempting a few pounces that showed her predatory instincts remained intact despite her captivity. But the real breakthrough came on a cool October morning. Emma was sitting closer to Serafina than ever before. Barely a foot separated them. She was reading aloud as had become their custom when she felt a weight against her shoulder. Serafina had leaned against her. Emma's breath caught. She didn't move, didn't react, just kept reading as if this was perfectly normal. Serafina's weight increased as she relaxed, and then Emma felt something she would never forget. The rumble of a purr. Not like a house cat's purr, but deeper, wilder, vibrating through Emma's entire body. Slowly, carefully, Emma raised her hand and placed it on Serafina's head. The bobcat didn't flinch. Emma began to stroke gently, feeling the soft fur, the solid muscle beneath. Serafina's purr intensified. They stayed like that for nearly an hour, until Emma's legs were completely numb and her back ached. She wouldn't have moved for anything in the world. When Margaret found them later, she stopped in her tracks. "My God," she breathed. "Emma, do you realize what you've done?" But Emma's mind was already moving to the next challenge. "She can't stay in captivity forever," she said, her hand still resting on Serafina's sleeping form. "She needs to be wild again." The debate was intense. Dr. Jim worried about Serafina's ability to survive after years in captivity. Margaret pointed out that she'd never learned to hunt properly. But Emma was adamant, and she had an ally in Jake Martinez, the officer who'd rescued Serafina. "That animal deserves a chance at real freedom," he said during a planning meeting. "If anyone can prepare her, it's Emma." So began Phase 2 of Serafina's rehabilitation. The center had a large enclosed area designed for pre-release conditioning, and Serafina was moved there. Emma's role shifted from companion to teacher. She started simple. Dead prey hidden around the enclosure forced Serafina to use her nose and hunting instincts to find food. At first, Serafina seemed confused by the game, looking to Emma for the usual handout. But Emma remained firm, encouraging her to search. The moment Serafina found her first hidden meal, her entire demeanor changed. Ancestral memories seemed to awaken as she crouched, stalked, and pounced on the already dead prey. Emma watched with pride and a growing sadness, knowing each successful hunt took Serafina closer to leaving. Live prey came next, mice and rats in controlled settings. Serafina's initial attempts were clumsy, her timing off after years of disuse. But she learned quickly, her natural instincts sharpening with each success. Emma celebrated every caught mouse, even as her heart grew heavier. They practiced for 2 months. Serafina grew stronger, more confident. Her coat gleamed with health, and her movements took on the fluid grace of a predator. She still came to Emma, still purred when they sat together. But something had changed. The wild was calling her home. The release site was carefully chosen, a remote area of Big Bend National Park with a healthy prey population and no resident bobcats to challenge a newcomer. The Texas Parks and Wildlife Department approved the plan, and Serafina was fitted with a GPS collar for monitoring. The December morning of release was cold and clear. Emma rode in the transport vehicle with Serafina, her hand resting on the crate where the bobcat waited. She could feel Serafina's tension, but it was different from the terror of months ago. This was anticipation. At the release site, Emma helped position the crate facing the open desert. The landscape stretched endlessly. Creosote bushes, rocky outcroppings, and distant mountains painted purple in the morning light. Bobcat country. "You ready, girl?" Emma whispered. Margaret stood back with the rest of the team, giving Emma space for this final moment. Emma knelt by the crate door, her hand on the latch. "I want you to know something," she said, her voice thick. "You taught me as much as I taught you. About trust, about healing, about second chances." She wiped away a tear. "Now go show this desert what you're made of." She pulled the latch. For a moment, nothing happened. Then Serafina emerged, not rushing, not fearful, but stepping out with careful purpose. She paused at the crate entrance, her amber eyes surveying this new world. The morning sun caught her coat, turning it to burnished gold. She took a step, then another. 20 feet from the crate, she stopped and turned back. Emma met her gaze, trying to memorize every detail: the tufted ears, the distinctive markings, the intelligence in those wild eyes. Serafina held the look for a long moment. Then she gave what Emma could only describe as a nod, a deliberate dip of her head, before turning back to the desert. She didn't run. She walked with measured steps, her tail held high until the landscape swallowed her spotted form. Emma stayed on her knees long after Serafina disappeared, tears streaming freely now. Margaret's hand settled on her shoulder. "You did it," Margaret said softly. "You gave her back her life." The GPS data over the following months told a story of success. Serafina established a territory, hunted successfully, and avoided human contact. She was surviving, no, thriving. The collar was designed to fall off after a year, ensuring she'd eventually be truly free of all human interference. Emma returned to her photography, but she was changed. She began specializing in wildlife rehabilitation stories, using her lens to show the world that broken creatures could heal, that trust could be rebuilt, that wildness could be restored. She never saw Serafina again, though she visited Big Bend often, always hoping. But she carried something better than a sighting: the memory of a terrified bobcat who chose to trust, who learned to play again, who reclaimed her birthright of freedom. Sometimes, on quiet nights when Emma reviewed her photographs, she would come across the few she'd taken during Serafina's rehabilitation. Her favorite showed Serafina mid-pounce during hunting practice, all 4 feet off the ground, joy evident in every line of her body. That was how Emma chose to remember her. Not as the terrified creature pressed against a cage wall, but as she was meant to be. Wild, free, magnificent. And sometimes, when the desert wind carried the sound of a bobcat's call across the Texas night, Emma would smile and whisper, "I hear you, girl. I hear you." The rehabilitation center used Serafina's story in their fundraising efforts, helping save dozens more animals. Her successful release became a model for treating severely traumatized wildlife. But for Emma, Serafina would always be more than a success story. She was proof that patience could heal what force could not touch. That trust, once shattered, could be rebuilt one quiet moment at a time. That sometimes the greatest gift we can give another living being is simply to sit with them in their fear until they're ready to step into the light. And in the vast wilderness of Big Bend, a bobcat with amber eyes and a spotted coat lived as her ancestors had, carrying within her the memory of a woman who taught her that not all human hands bring pain. Some bring the way home.